with regard to, and this was also true with the Republic of Turkey, that there is one narrative. It needs to be maintained through both the educational system and in the national institutions.
What are the differences between epistemic and justice?
Well, in the process of translating it, they're changing the stories, they're changing the fiction. I start digging deeper to see, well, where did this person study? And it turns out all the degrees are from Azerbaijani universities.
Now we see that these international organizations somehow are they cannot influence on totalitarian regimes or to influence on this denialism policy.
But again, it's been now almost 2 months since the ceasefire, and that violence continues because the system is such that sovereignty of states still is the dominant model.
Hello everyone, today our guest is Dr. Armեն Մարսուբյան from the Southern Connecticut University, New Haven. Armեն Marsubian is a distinguished professor of philosophy at Southern Connecticut State University and an affiliated faculty member of the Institute of Human Rights at the University of Connecticut. He is renowned for his extensive work in moral philosophy, genocide studies, and Armenian history. Marsubian has held the position of editor-in-chief of Metaphilosophy and served as the 2022 Janian visiting professor of Armenian studies at Columbia University. Dr. Marsubian, thank you very much for accepting our invitation and joining us today. We are very honored to have you here.
Thank you, Heike. I'm pleased to be here. I much enjoyed visiting and hearing you a year ago in Barcelona, and I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much. Today we will discuss about epistemic injustice because it's very interesting to know how epistemic injustice in national narrative works, and actually what are the differences between epistemic injustice and in general other types of injustice.
Yes, it's a relatively new concept that was developed by a British philosopher, Miranda Fricker. Her work started in about 2006-07, very influential work titled Epistemic Injustice. And it was looking, when we think of injustice, we think of restrictions, inequities between people, how people are treated. That is true, but this has to do with how we communicate and understand our experience. If we don't have the right concepts, the right words, we don't have an audience, we're not heard. And that's where the injustice comes from. Epistemology is an old Greek word, and it refers to knowledge. And this is seeing how knowledge gets manipulated to keep certain voices silent. It originated with concerns about women's voices, what are called subaltern groups, minorities, whose stories and testimony is not first listened to, but more importantly, the community doesn't have the words or the terminology to communicate to the larger audience. It's a very interesting way of looking at how we suppress people's voices. If you don't have a word for something, you can't communicate it. And the one example I use in the paper I gave at the philosophy conference was the idea of marital rape. You think of marriage and you think of the obligations in marriage, and you don't think of the fact that one can be raped by one's partner, because that isn't a concept, a category that one has. And this is the aspect called hermeneutical injustice, or the aspect of you don't have the terminology to talk about it. And so this came out of a lot of work in minority studies, feminist studies, but I've now applied it in terms of more questions of denial of crimes.
That's what I'm going to ask you, because how we can put epistemic injustice in the background of denialism, of genocide, of vandalism, or other, forced displacement of people, how this can be a kind of background or a result. What do you think, and how we can also connect it to what's happened with Nagorno-Karabakh, with Artsakh people, and why actually Azerbaijan, with its denialism, actually uses this type of injustice for just forwarding its policy.
Yeah, it applies to how one shapes a national narrative. And the idea that with regard to, and this was also true with the Republic of Turkey, that there is one narrative. It needs to be maintained through both the educational system and in the national institutions. And one way you do that is you don't give access to minority voices. And as we know, in the Republic of Turkey, for decades and decades, the Armenian community there had to be silent, and their experience was not part of any conversation that was going on in terms of the intellectual sphere for many decades. That started to change, but there is this similar situation in Azerbaijan before the breakup of the Soviet Union, where the Soviet system allowed certain stories to be told within their concept of the brotherhood of peoples, and there were only certain bounds one could go past. And that kind of control of the national narrative was taken up by Azerbaijan at independence. And we find it then, just give you an example, the claim by Azerbaijan that they respect minorities, and it's not a discrimination against a Christian minority. And they will highlight one other minority group in Azerbaijan and say these are the descendants of the Caucasian Albanians. And the Armenian landscape, the Armenian cultural heritage is not Armenian. They've been appropriated, so that when people say, from outside observers, they'll say, well, what's the problem? The churches are there, they're medieval churches, they're going to protect them, but they've reinscribed them as non-Armenian, and it allows them to maintain this kind of, it's not all that different from the way propaganda is used within society. But to just give you another illustration, within the attempt by the Azerbaijani government to change its alphabet. They were using the Cyrillic alphabet, now they're going to the Latin alphabet. So they're translating a lot of the literature that was produced in the Soviet era into the Latin alphabet from the Cyrillic. Well, in the process of translating it, they're changing the stories, they're changing the fiction. So they're making the Armenians that were in the old fictional literature even conform to this stereotype. So when young people encounter this literature, they are going to be reinforced with this idea of what the bad Armenian, and this is in a way they won't even have the vocabulary to talk about Armenians aside from this stereotype of Armenians. So that's the idea that what we call sort of hermeneutical injustice. They don't have the terminology to talk about Armenians because all the concepts related to Armenian fit a certain kind of a narrative, and that narrative is to deny the presence of the Armenians in their historic lands.
Yeah. So this epistemic injustice is a kind of tool for reconstructing the history, rewriting the history, and also creating history. Because we know that, for example, you brought the example of Caucasian Albanians and how they refer to medieval heritage of Armenians to Caucasian Albanian, and also said that, for example, Armenian vandalized all these churches, monasteries, put their inscriptions and sign of cross, everything. So Armenians are vandalizing our culture. And in this way, putting this narrative in their history, the younger population of Azerbaijani took it as a reality, as a real fact, and that's starting how the history is reconstructing and rewriting, and this is very very complicated and very dangerous thing for Armenians and for Armenian history as well. So what do you think, what should be the counteract of this policy and of this philosophy, for this theory?
Well, one thing that we have in our favor is that the nature of media has changed, so that there can be suppression of digital media and the web, but it's often very ineffective. But one has to be careful that you don't then provide propaganda in response to propaganda. So it's going to be difficult, but the scholarship has to be strong about the Armenian presence in the Caucasus. It has to be clear. It has to be non-denial of the Azerbaijani presence, but it has to acknowledge the culture that the Azerbaijanis had, and it has to put it in the context of its relationship to the Armenian culture that predated, obviously, the arrival of the Turkic peoples, but you can't just say the Turkic peoples, were a minority. They weren't here. They were just appeared all of a sudden. No, they were here, but you have to do it in a way that you're not following a kind of propaganda model, and I'm not. And you have to make sure that the scholarship in the rest of the world is aware that the scholarship produced out of Azerbaijan doesn't meet world-class standards. I see this all the time. I see an article that winds up being on the internet. It's claimed some author has some degree that I start digging deeper to see, well, where did this person study? And it turns out all the degrees are from Azerbaijani universities. Nothing you will rarely see among these kind of rewriting of history articles that appear to be scholarly. You will never see someone studied in a reputable Western university. And so there needs to be diligence on the part of Armenian scholars, not to just say, oh, there goes another Azerbaijani, crazy, story that they published this weird article. No, you have to make, whatever discipline you're in, realize what the signs of this attempt of infiltrating scholarship. And, you have to be aware that there's a lot of money behind this in Azerbaijan, and it puts us at a disadvantage. But if you look at all the, very expensive books that are produced, the color productions of all the Caucasian Armenian monasteries and churches, and these books are, copies of them are distributed around the world. I find them in the Harvard Library, and also the electronic versions are available. And I use them in my lectures to show, here, this is their narrative, and the fact that the Armenian alphabet was created in what is now Azerbaijan, and that monastery is now under threat, and somehow, it's an Caucasian Armenian church is it needs to be called out. So, scholars are not always the best activists, but I think that scholarship has to be, especially Armenian scholarship, has to be activist in its work, and I'm seeing it. I see it in Armenian studies. So
I really hope that actually now Armenian scholarship is really doing its best to show all these the cases of falsification, and also to be very, not to do the propaganda, the same propaganda, but to show the real facts, to be in academic level. So the denialism actually, as you wrote in the paper, provokes another case of genocide, vandalism. So denialism in that the perpetrator can continue its policy, or we will have the future genocidal cases. And can we also connect the Turkish made a genocide for Armenians in the beginning of the 20th century and the denialism of Turkish as a continuation of what did Azerbaijan with Artsakh people in Nagorno-Karabakh?
Yeah, I mean, there is the connection, and this, what we saw with the 2020 war and subsequent is a level of gratuitous violence on the part of the military in Azerbaijan. It wasn't just, the drones from the sky. There were just horrendous cases of, and we saw it in Armenia on the border with the horrendous desecration of a woman Armenian soldier. It's clear that those soldiers have been so brought up with this kind of hatred that that's a danger. So it's not, that's the kind of perpetrator that commits crimes against humanity and war crimes, and that's a real concern. So with regard to Turkey, of course, Azerbaijan couldn't have done what it did without the assistance of Turkey, without the assistance of Erdogan, both militarily but also in terms of the kind of cover for Turkey is a U.S. ally. We didn't want to jeopardize our relationships with Turkey, and Turkey is, supposedly our border with Russia. But all those balances don't make any sense anymore, because Turkey has been not behaving as an ally. All the excuses we've made about not upsetting Turkey, the fact that we want Turkey to be in the EU, that's not going to happen while Erdogan's in power. So I see the same. I'm more hopeful for Turkey than Azerbaijan, because in a way, despite all the suppression that's gone on in Turkey, all the scholars that have left and the journalists who are in jail and the civil activists that their voices have been silent, they haven't succeeded in silencing everyone in Turkey, and more and more people are aware of the history that is somehow not the national narrative there, much more so than Azerbaijan. So if there is change in Turkey in the next election in 2 years, that will make a big difference, because I think that they are the opposition, for all its faults, the CHP, Kemalist Party, for all its faults, has been more open to a genuine dialogue with Armenia than the current AKP. And once that starts, Azerbaijan will be left on its own in a way that, ultimately they're not going to turn their backs on Azerbaijan, but it's the idea that Turkey will not do anything with Armenia until Azerbaijan tells it so. It's like the tail wagging the dog, as we say in the United States. And once Turkey is not, under the sort of restraint that Azerbaijan has created, every time we hear a little, well, Turkey will open the border. No, Azerbaijan says. And I think once that happens, it will be good for Armenia, because it will make Armenia less isolated, and I think anything that makes Armenia less isolated and reliant on the few neighbors that it has that it's not in conflict with, the better. But again, we'll see. In the next 2 years, I think, will be very, very important for Armenia's future, if we can get there. Yes. So we have our issues, and of course I could say much about that, but I'm here to talk about.
Yeah. What is more interesting for me, that actually after Second World War, the international organizations were created just because to stop that in the future there will no more genocide, no more war. But now we see that these international organizations somehow are they cannot influence on totalitarian regimes or to influence on this denialism policy. What do you think what's the main issue here? Why it can't actually be so powerful or so useful tool for preventing genocide?
One of the big problems is that when this idea of the United Nations was created, it was created on the initiative of the victors. And the victors gave themselves the greatest power in the structure of the United Nations, and that's the Security Council. And the 5 permanent members have the ultimate say-so with regard to that body acting as a group. And almost at its birth, those 5 powers were in conflict with the Cold War. And we thought, with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the so-called end of the Cold War, we would be more working on the same page with Russia, and the idea that China was being progressively, there was an opening up in China. There was a belief that they would be more willing to be cooperative with the world community. Both have had setbacks. So that ideal, I think, is not, there's no way to change that structure. And there are very few cases where you can get all of the Security Council, especially the permanent members. I mean, it took how many months for the Gaza ceasefire? First, it was, the United States vetoing it. Then it was Russia. Then the United States. So finally, they got something. But again, it's been now almost 2 months since the ceasefire. And that violence continues because the system is such that sovereignty of states still is the dominant model, and that has been the source of the greatest violence in humanity. And Raphael Lemkin, back when he first started reading about the Armenian massacres, became the Armenian genocide, he was saying, why does a country have control of its citizens and other countries cannot stop a country from mistreating its citizens? It's because of this notion of state sovereignty. And the Genocide Convention was the first attempt to, say, no, it doesn't stop at the border. But the mechanism for enforcing it is not there. Even though the Genocide Convention doesn't require the United Nations to act, the signatories of the Genocide Convention, if you're ratified the Genocide Convention, you as a nation have an obligation to intervene. You don't have to get the okay from the United Nations. Of course, that often is abused.
I see. Thank you very much, Dr. Marsubian. It was our pleasure to have you here, and thank you for your time. Hope that all these totalitarian regimes will not exist anymore in one day.
Yes. Well, I'm hoping in your lifetime. Of course, in my lifetime, I would, but I'm not that optimistic. But I would hope in your lifetime, and certainly in my children's generation, that would be the case. So thank you for this conversation.
Thank you. Today, our guest was Dr. Armեն Մարսուբյան from the Southern Connecticut State University, New Haven.